Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Be Curious LATES event, Fabric Futures. A live transcript is available for this event. The link will be provided in the chat now. Click this to follow along with us. My name is Dr. Matthew Davis, and I'll be your host for tonight. I'm an associate professor here in the Business School at the University of Leeds. I would love to know where you're joining us from tonight. So if you're able, please could you pop in details of where you are, your location, into the comments box on YouTube. Now, in each LATES event, we invite you to take a peek at what's going on inside a university with help from University of Leeds researchers and partners that they work with. Our speakers tonight are connected by a theme. Our event tonight is the final in a series of 3 LATES we've been doing, all about the cotton industry. We'll be considering what a more sustainable future looks like for cotton and the fashion industry, and the role that businesses and consumers can play to ensure a fairer future for all in the global supply chain. And thank you very much. I can see some comments coming in already to say where people are from. We've got somebody else from Leeds, which is fantastic to see. Another one from Leeds as well, from North Yorkshire. I'm sure we'll see some other locations popping up as we go through. Wherever you're joining us from tonight, you are most welcome, and we're delighted you could join us for the event. Each of our speakers tonight will give you their take on the theme. After that, we'll be inviting questions from you. So I'm really pleased to see that the chat box is working. It'd be quite a silent event otherwise. If you have a question for a speaker, just post it in the chat, which you should see to the right if you're viewing the event in YouTube. To participate in the live chat, you'll be required to sign in to YouTube using a Google account. If you'd rather not log in, that's perfectly fine. And you're happy just to watch along and view others' contributions. That's also okay too. Our moderator team will be keeping an eye on the chat and would love to say hello to some of you this evening. And I'm sure I can see them kind of typing away already. They'll be monitoring the chat as we go through. So if there's a question that comes to you, don't feel that you have to wait until the speaker has finished talking. Pop it in the chat and we'll pick it up as we go through. Now, I'm absolutely delighted to say I'm joined by 3 speakers this evening: Sushma Iyengar, Simon Ferrigno, and Professor Surender Munjal. And I'll give you a full introduction to each of our exciting speakers as we go through. So each speaker will have an opportunity to talk. We'll have an opportunity for some questions. And then at the end, we'll bring everybody back together to pick up on some of the other questions that have come in and the themes that cut across. Now, our first speaker this evening is Simon. And I think we'll see Simon on screen in a moment. Hi, Simon. So Simon is a consultant, a researcher, and a writer on sustainability. He's experienced in field research, advising brands and NGOs, and public communication. And he's been active for a long time in this space. And I'm absolutely delighted that we've got the opportunity to hear your thoughts tonight, and I think particularly around regenerative farming. There's full details of Simon's background in the event details. But Simon, I'd like to pass over to you because I know you've got some great thoughts and interesting ideas around a more sustainable future to share with us.
So good evening, everybody. Just leaving this slide here for the moment. So I've been working in organic cotton for about, over 20 years now, starting with Pesticide Action Network UK and then becoming freelance a few years ago. And with regards to regenerative, I mean, when I was talking with Mark about this session, we talked about the future and being a little bit optimistic about it, which is, as I was just coming out of writing a lot about the outcomes of the IPPC, I wasn't so sure I could be, but regenerative is sort of a buzzword at the moment, and I'm a little bit cautious about the term because we have, on the one hand, people who are trying to define and centralize it and turn it into yet another standard that farmers will have to certify to at great cost, and where potentially that standard is not adapted to what's actually going on in people's literal farmyards. On the other hand, regenerative is a concept which looks at local areas, local issues, and a little bit like the due diligence approaches, which are becoming something that is being legislated for. They offer great hope of being able to identify and solve problems at a local level with the people who are concerned in an order of importance. But I think it's a bit of a state of mind. It's about not using things up. It's about replacing, repairing, recycling, reusing, renewing, caring, looking after. Having grown up in France, to me, it's got a lot in comparison with what the French call a terroir approach. You don't look at a crop. You look at the whole area you live in. You look at the food culture. You look at the social culture. You look at the people. You look at the landscape. You look at what people have grown. You look at what you like to eat. And that's what you grow. And in the case of fibers, you may add those into the mix as well. So I think of it regenerative. It's a hyper-local approach. And in the same way that each region, in my opinion, has its own Mediterranean diet, and we shouldn't be pushing on the globalized food system onto people when we need to do the same thing with both food and fiber. And of course, we're moving towards a more circular economy. So we're not going to necessarily be putting new inputs in all the time. But each region may, of course, provide new inputs because particularly with cotton at some point, however much we recycle, we are going to need some new inputs. And with that, we need to remember that cotton is a very, very old crop that originates in the Indus Valley. That's the point it was first domesticated. We have evidence of cotton threads about 8,000 years ago in Mohenjo-Daro. We know that cotton was traded thousands of years ago. We know that one of the oldest names we know for cotton is in Tamil, Paruti. So it's not going to go away, but the future's probably a lot slower as well as more regenerative. But it's also going to be technical. So I'm just going to see if I can move the slide along. There is going to be some technology there. One of the things we know is happening a lot in cotton and other crops is that there's a loss of labor. People want to go to better jobs. They want to go to cities where there's more opportunities. And a lot of people who end up on farms these days would probably like to be elsewhere. I'll come back to that. So as well as landscapes that to be regenerative need to be diverse, I think they're going to need a lot of robots, a lot of automation, but not automation the way it's being pushed necessarily by big multinationals. There's people in India and elsewhere who are working on small-scale robotics, things that adapt to a system that mean that to be efficient, you don't need a 10,000 hectare field or 1,000 hectare field. You can work perfectly easily in half an acre or a hectare. So that's my vision, but it starts with, on the one hand, healthy soils, which means a very diverse landscape, diverse cropping system, something that doesn't, all those pictures are working farms. And the two on the left don't actually look like farms at all in the way that people in Europe or North America might understand them, but the way people in Africa and India probably will recognize. And that is going to be, I think, in future aided by technology. So to go back and to finish back to my first slide, whenever I've been working in the field, you're always going to sit down somewhere where there's going to be a lot of children. And at the moment, the future for those children, sadly, is all too often going to be, if your parents are landowners, you're going to become a farmer, and if they're not, you're going to become a farm worker. And I look at them and I always think, well, there's doctors, there's engineers, there's astrophysicists. And that particular village in West Africa, I've had that conversation. The first time I went to meet them, they said, well, we don't think we can afford to send our children to school. But they converted to organic. They started earning more money. Most of the children have now been to secondary school. And I remember on one later visit, one of them said, where do I go to study astrophysics? So it's about regenerative means also changing the opportunity. People have to do something else with their lives to make a choice. And some may choose, and I've met plenty of farmers in India who've gone back to farming from having been software programmers, from having been engineers. But it's all about giving people choices to do something with their lives that isn't necessarily what destiny has set for them. And I think with that, I'll conclude and look forward to hearing the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. I think it's interesting. I think kind of raising the question around what the future of farming might look like and thinking about sustainability. Really interested in the idea of that hyper-local approach, and I'm sure we can explore that a little bit more in a moment. And also this idea of slower and where slower fits. And I think we've probably got a theme that we might pick up later on around slower fashion as well, and the implications of that. And I'll pause for a moment just to ask people watching at home if there's questions that you'd like to ask Simon about this topic. So thinking about regenerative, thinking about these hyper-local approaches to farming, and how does this fit? I think if we think about the challenges around production and profitable production as well, and how this fits together. But Simon, I've got a first question, if I can really, which is, what role do you think? We've talked a lot in past events around India in particular. So what role do you think the Indian farmers have in the design of what regenerative farming looks like? So how that might look for them and in their context and within the industry that they work in?
Well, I think in India, you're going to find a range of approaches at the moment. So you're going to find people, as I mentioned, people who think you can define regenerative centrally are going to be telling farmers what to do. And then you're going to find other projects, usually smaller projects or more innovative projects, who are going to be working and probably have been working with farmers for a very long time on working within the landscape and within the needs of the areas they're in. So the farmers have the knowledge. And again, this predates the concept of regenerative, but you can actually find in old Indian writings concepts that are very similar to organic or regenerative, but it's about working with the landscape, working with the people. And so those projects, and you've got people like Chetna Organic or BioRay who will be doing things with farmers, and that is understanding how they grow, what they grow, helping farmers or getting farmers to input to that process of what is the best way to do things in an area in terms of managing water, managing soils, managing crop rotations in a way that is culturally appropriate, because this is something that doesn't get talked about enough, but cotton farms are food farms. So it's making sure that in your crop rotation you are allowing people to grow what is part of their traditional diet or something that can be used by workers. And thinking of farms that I visited in the past, that you find that very, very commonly. So yeah, I think it's letting people decide. It should be the norm, but it's not the norm at the moment.
That's really interesting. Really interesting to hear about the. I've never really thought about cotton farms also being, I guess, producing food as well. I always think a single crop, so it's really interesting to hear. Another question really that kind of leads on from this. Then I think that localized approach, that kind of I guess empowered approach for farmers. What are the challenges then to moving towards this? Is a more sustainable or more localized way of production, is that more expensive in terms of the cotton that's produced, or?
No, it's not necessarily more expensive. In fact, it's probably more efficient, because you're going to be able to either use those other crops or sell those other crops. So that's going to immediately reduce crops. You're also going to be using those crops to feed your soil. So you're very likely going to be saving money on fertilizer. You're going to have less soil erosion, probably better moisture retention. All of those things together are going to reduce costs of irrigation, cost of soil management, probably use of technology. So there are definitely costs, and in future there are going to be costs of things, of new technology like robotics, but all of that can be managed. Part of the challenge, of course, is always to make sure that people are getting a fair price for what they produce, and that's.
And I think that question of fairness, I think within the industries we've been looking at and thinking particularly around fashion and textiles. We know that there's a challenge inherent within the supply chains there. So thank you so much. I think that's a really nice start to do this evening's discussion. And I think some of these ideas, particularly around I think sustainability, maybe some of the cost and other challenges that come through, we'll probably pick up with Surender and then again later in the discussion. So thank you so much. So I think at this point it would be good to introduce our second speaker, who will help us to think about another aspect of this topic. So I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by my colleague, who, because of COVID, we haven't seen so much of each other over the last couple of years. So it's lovely to be at an event together again. Professor Surender Munjal, who is a professor of international business and management here at the University of Leeds. And prior to joining us in Leeds, he worked as a senior lecturer in the University of Delhi. And he is an international expert on the Indian economy and Indian multinational enterprises, publishing a whole range of academic publications and consultancy work all over the place as well. So I'm really pleased that Surender is able to join us and share his thoughts this evening, particularly around more the economic aspects of the industry that we've been talking about in the last few events, and particularly around sustainability and the future as well. So, Surender, thank you very much for joining us, and I will pass over to you, and I'm really interested to hear what you have to share.
My pleasure, Pat. This is a great honor to be able to come and speak to you and the audience on this particular topic, which relates very much to India. And I was delighted to hear Simon when he said that the origin of cotton can be traced back to Indus Valley, Mohenjo-daro. So the connection of cotton with India is as old as civilization. But fast forward, I will bring you to the pre-colonial era when India was ruled by the Britain, and that was the time when cotton again came into picture in this modern Indian context. So in that particular era when Britishers were ruling India, you might know, an audience might know, that Mahatma Gandhi launched in 1930s several movements, and one of them was called Swadeshi Movement. The idea was that the cotton that is being produced in India should be further processed and converted into textile in India rather than being produced in UK and then brought back in terms of garment and textile back to India, where Indians would not get their due share of employment, and then they have to pay more prices in terms of importing stuff from the Britain. So cotton has been always a very important product in Indian economy. If I throw some statistics to you and to the audience, you might be delighted to know that about 14 to 16% of agricultural production is cotton. And if you combine the whole textile industry with cotton, it accounts for about 7% of the total industrial production of India. And in terms of the GDP, it accounts for about 2% of national income. And that's for India. Obviously, cotton is very important for Indian economy for providing employment, as I said. So about 6 million farmers do farming, cotton farming in India, and about 40 to 50 million people are employed in related industries. So knowing that India is such a large country, I think you and others would not be very surprised to say to know that India is one of the largest producer as well as one of the largest consumer of cotton as well as textiles. So worldwide, India is the second largest textile producer, and its share in the worldwide textile production is 4% of the worldwide trade. Obviously, the domestic market in itself is quite huge, as India is the second most populous country in the world. The whole domestic market itself accounts for 150 billion US dollar. That is the size of industry in India. In terms of, if you look at the exports, India current exports in 2021 were about 41 billion US dollar. And government is obviously pushing for this particular sector. As I said, that this is one of the most important sector, both in terms of providing employment as well as its historical roots. So Indian government plans to increase the export of textile from 41 billion to 100 billion by 25-26. And lots of schemes and the government bodies are linked to do this, to achieve this target. For example, the Export Promotion Council of India. Government have actually launched many schemes, and I will give you some names here. One of them is called Mitra Scheme, and Mitra here stands for, Mitra in Hindi really means friend. So the Mitra basically stands for Mega Investment Textile Park, and here government has planned to launch 7 textile parks. So these are the industrial parks which are specifically dedicated for textile production. And obviously the idea is to build that capacity so that the 100 billion target can be achieved in the near future. And obviously to make the industry more competitive. There is another scheme called Samarth, and Samarth, actually it's a Hindi word again, and it accounts for the power. The Samarth basically stands for Scheme for Capacity in Textile Sector. And here the government plans to skill at least 1 million people who are working or aspiring to work in the textile sector. There are lots of production-linked incentive schemes which are in operation, schemes that are related with the technology upgradation so that the industry can be more competitive as well as more advanced. Market access schemes which are targeted to aid exporters so that they can produce better and they can export their production. The industry bodies such as CITI is the Confederation of Indian Textile Industries, are working around the country. So about 90,000 farmers are linked with the body and about 1,700 villages in India. And the body, the CITI, is trying to improve their production yield and also helping them to produce sustainably. The another public sector undertaking called CCI, Cotton Corporation of India, is actively involved in supporting farmers by purchasing cotton so that they get due income from their production. Obviously, there's a long way to go because we understand a lot of farmers do not get enough income. And sometimes this also leads to suicide by farmers because they are quite trapped in debts. I think that gives you the overall impression of how important textile is in the Indian context and what different things Indian government is doing. And indeed, there is a long way to go, although there is a long success story. But in terms of providing support to farmers, there's a long way to go further. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Surender. Really interesting to hear you talk through, and I think particularly in terms of getting a sense of the continuing size and importance of this industry to India in particular. I've got a couple of questions in mind. If there's anything that people at home would like to ask Surender whilst we're on this topic, particularly thinking around India in particular and some of the economic aspects of this, please do add your questions in the comments box on YouTube, and we'll pick those up. But I had a first question, and I've got a second one as well, if I can come to that in a moment. But first, you mentioned around the government target for expanding export, and there being a real drive for this at the moment. Is that also a drive to increase production or just export? Is it the two things together, or just looking to increase the export market?
Right. I think that's an interesting question. And the answer is it's production and export together. Because if you think about the overall production, this is being consumed either in the domestic market or in the international market, right? The international market was obviously very wide in comparison to the domestic market of India. A lot of production is obviously getting consumed within the country, but now the idea that the government has is to increase production, increase the quality, increase the efficiency, so that you could compete with the textile coming from other countries such as Bangladesh as well as China, right? So it's about increasing the production capabilities, capacity, and efficiency.
Brilliant, thank you. And I've got another question as well. So one of the things that has come up in our discussions in the earlier late sessions that we've held on this topic is this idea of slow fashion. So moving away from fast fashion and overconsumption towards buying less but buying better and higher quality and more durable products and clothing in particular. What are your thoughts around the potential impact of maybe a widespread move towards slow fashion on the Indian economy and what this might mean for people's livelihoods? You said what a large percentage or significant percentage of the economy, cotton and fashion and textiles in particular are.
Okay, I think again this is a very great question. This is quite interesting and fascinating to understand and to think what will be the impact if the fast fashion industry slows down, which I think is probably not going to happen so easily. Indian young population, as you understand, India is quite young population in terms of the mean age. India is a young country, and there's lots and lots of westernization which is taking place. So fast fashion is actually is growing in India. But let's assume that if push towards sustainability, durability, and all those things comes in, I'm sure that this will have an impact, because then you would not have as much production as you would have or as you would have expected to grow in the near future. But then there will be a bit more different push in terms of producing more sustainable as well as more durable products, which I think would require another type of skill, another type of inputs, another type of designs, and another type of things that goes along, technology, for example, that goes along. Generally speaking, I think this would have an impact in terms of slowing down the production and its contribution to the GDP, and that will have some impact on employment as well as on exports.
But from what you're saying, then, is the potential, though, that the roles that are left within that industry maybe become more high skilled and pay goes up, or?
Yes, obviously, then you are looking for products which are, which would not probably be seen very easily out of fashion. Things which remains quite durable, and if you wear them, you would still feel that they are new, which means that the role of technology will then come in. The role of designers will also then come in. So obviously, there will be a shift in the way in which the product is being produced and the way in which it is being consumed. But certainly that means that there will be a decline in the volume of production.
And I'd be interested, I think, maybe asking people at home whether they think slow fashion is something that is likely to come about, or whether it's more of an aspiration than a likely reality. Is it a niche thing? Is it something that you can see going mainstream? Because I think it's an interesting idea that keeps coming up. So we're really interested in people's views. And another question for you, Surender, if I may.
Yeah.
Another theme that's come up in previous events is the idea around circular economy. So we've got slow fashion, we've also got circular economy and reusing product, maybe breaking them apart, making new products, or looking at how we reuse waste resources within production processes. Are you seeing shifts towards this in India as well, in terms of how people are approaching production?
Well, there's an article that I have recently published in Journal of Business Research about circular economy and the small and medium enterprises. But I can tell you that the way in which the circular economy operates in India is unimaginable. A lot of this is in the unorganized sector, therefore it goes unnoticed. Any small piece of textile that you would expect would have been consumed in an Indian household would be recycled or reused in some ways. I can tell you. And if they don't, then there are vendors who would come and buy them, right? And you will get something in exchange, or you would get some money out of it. And finally, you could sometimes also donate your used textile to people who are in the lower income brackets. And there are lots and lots of ways in which this happens in India. And a lot of this happens in a very unorganized way, and therefore it goes very, very much unnoticed. But I think the question about the circular economy is quite interesting, and it is very widely being used, and it is unimaginable, as I said.
And I think it's interesting that we're still grappling with the idea, I think, say here in the UK, around how do we start to bring the ideas of circularity into our manufacturing and production processes. But as you say, it's part of life by the sounds of it in all sorts of ways in India already.
Yeah. Since
Lovely.
ages. Actually, this is happening since ages. So this is in the blood of India. Yeah.
It's so interesting to hear, and I think we're likely to pick back up, I think, on some of these cultural differences and things we can learn from one another. I think after Sushma's talk as well. So thank you very much, Surender. I think this is a good point to move towards our final speaker and the next topic that we have for this evening. So thank you. So I'm delighted now as well to introduce Sushma Iyengar. And Sushma is joining us today from London, if I got that right. But normally you're based in India, and I'll let you talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But delighted that Sushma is able to join us. She's a social educator, a worker, particularly known for her work in the field of community empowerment and women's empowerment in particular. She's undertaken a number of masters and academic studies. But in particular, she's for more than 3 decades led transformative action with marginalized communities in the area of sorry, I get my words out this evening, gender justice, indigenous cultures, traditional livelihoods, and local governance. And particularly, I think one of the things we'll hear about tonight is initiative that Sushma has been instrumental in, Karmir, and apologies if I've mispronounced, but a platform for craft artisans which works with the ecology of their crafts. Really interesting. And I think it speaks to some of these ideas around hyperlocalization, thinking about different ways of organizing and producing. But so excited, so many different initiatives, I think, Sushma, we've been involved in at the grassroots, which really speak to these themes that have been coming through. So with that, I'm so happy to hand over and to hear some of the experiences that you have to share. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Thank you for LATES to invite me here and to accommodate the time here when I'm in London. I think you provided the perfect, both Simon and Professor Munjal have provided the perfect backdrop for me to share a little story of revitalizing an old world cotton. And I will try and take you quickly through the story of how an indigenous cotton called Kala, actually authentically Sakala, and its textile crafts has been revitalized in a region which is on the western tip of India called Kutch, which is where I live and work. And it's a process which has reactivated a local loop by the farmers, spinners, and artisans of the region with the support of the organization I represent here, Khamir. However, before I do that, I just want to kind of continue a little from what Professor Munjal and Simon spoke about, and just take you back a little to the lost heritage of India's indigenous cotton. And when we're talking of it, the indigenous cotton, it's really the old world cotton vis-a-vis the new world cotton, which is American cotton. And the story of the lost heritage of indigenous cotton rests on a tale which interestingly intersects the political economies of America, Britain, and India. In the early 18th century, after more than 100 years of importing India's indigenous cotton, and from other parts of the world, Britain's mills, the famed mills of Lancashire and Manchester, were actually designed to absorb and spin the American cotton. However, the American War of Revolution in the late 18th century disrupted the supply and led to severe shortages of raw cotton exports from America to Britain. Left with the longer fiber, and so the mills in Britain had actually got used to the long staple American cotton and had been designed for that. And when the supply got disrupted, Britain had to look elsewhere to sustain these mills. Where else would it find land so generous to cotton as in India and Africa? There was a problem though. If British mills were to spring alive, the short and coarse fibers of the old world cotton, indigenous cotton, which was growing in India, would have to be replaced by the longer staple American cotton varieties. And so the new cotton varieties began to arrive in India. And for nearly 150 years after that, they struggled to replace this really stubborn and resilient 5,000-year-old heritage of Gossypium arboreum and Gossypium herbaceum. These are the two indigenous cotton genetic varieties found in India. But then the local short staple cottons, which was widespread, stood their ground. And even when India became independent in 1947, almost 100 years after this process had begun of trying to introduce American cotton, in 1947, 97% of the cotton areas of farming continue to remain under these local cotton varieties. However, in the 75 years following that, since India's independence from colonial rule, the situation fully reversed. And today, more than 97 to 98% of India's cotton fields are filled with American cotton and the BT cotton, the genetically modified varieties, and less than 1% is indigenous or with Old World, which is coarser and short staple. So post-independence, even the Indian mills, which were also designed for long staple length of American cotton varieties, had discarded the local indigenous cotton for thinking they are coarse and inferior. And over time, all the traditional techniques, artisanal techniques associated with developing the fiber of Old World cottons went out of practice. And therefore, this effectively crushed the value loops, the interdependencies, the interdependent economy and the cultures between farmers, spinners, weavers, dyers, and tailors. Interestingly, even this process of the introduction of long staple cotton did not fully impact the more arid regions of India, which actually till the 1970s continued to grow, spin, weave, and wear the coarser varieties. For instance, in the region I come from in Kutch, till 2000, most of the cotton farming was largely Old World cotton. That it's in the last 20 years when India joined the world in its policy plunge towards genetically modified varieties of cotton, and cotton strode over the rain-fed farmers, because this is largely drought-ridden, scarce regions which produce these indigenous short staple varieties. And in only 16 years, we found that almost 96% of our cotton farms in the region I am in turned to BT cotton, which is highly productive, very water intensive, of a variety of long staple cotton. And today farmlands covered under BT cotton actually guzzle almost 25% of the total farm pesticides used in the country. So let me get back to Kala cotton, which is the rain-fed short staple cotton. It requires just one rainfall. It requires about 7 to 9 inches of rain. But can even grow with even less than that. It's well adapted to semi-arid conditions and erratic rainfalls, exactly what Simon was speaking about. It can grow in less than 300 mm of rainfall, as I said, and does not need irrigation, chemical pesticides, or fertilizers. And it has really deep root systems, the deepest of all cultivated cotton, which makes it highly resilient to disease, pests, droughts, soil salinity, and climatic stresses. So they are highly resilient to huge climatic variabilities. And it's one of the few cotton species remaining in India. And when we saw this huge collapse of Kala cotton, and of course farmers in an arid area reaching out to highly irrigated water-intensive forms of BT cotton, which is when there were a small group of farmers who were still stubbornly with this, but were slowly losing ground. That's the beauty of this plant. Again, as Simon was saying, that it is adapted and interdependent with various other livelihoods and economies, and so it's a closed bowl of cotton, which means that the ball is removed before you can get at the lint, and the seed are separated. So farmers actually use all parts of the plant. Leaves and bowls are used as livestock feed with the pastoralists. Seed is pressed for oil, and remnants are fed to cattle, and then the cotton is sold or turned to yarn. All of these interdependencies had completely broken down. And so in 2006, with a small group of marginal farmers, we started revitalizing and enabling them to get a premium, and started organizing the farmers. And the farmers were really dependent on this premium to sustain it. And that's how they slowly sustained, continued, and it slowly grew. Within the first 4 or 5 years, once they started stabilizing and staying with the kala, and kala is grown along with a range of other 7 or 8 millets and pulses, and it is that which maintains the soil health. But given the economics of our agriculture policy, these varieties are not subsidized, and neither are artisanal skills or handlooms as subsidized as the mechanized spinning of yarn, of long staple yarns. And so we had to start providing a premium to ensure that they continued with it. From that, within a few years, we started activating spinners and revitalizing spinners who had actually lost the skill of spinning short staple cotton yarns. And then on to weavers who started weaving the kala with a lot of resistance and reluctance initially, because a whole generation of weavers now had lost the skill and the art of weaving short staple cotton, which are far more fragile and can break. So even the looms had actually got adapted to the finer cottons or to silk, and not to these slightly coarser cottons. It's been a long journey. It's almost been 15 years of kala cotton. I'm not sharing photographs here, but if you can go onto Google and put kala cotton, you will find a whole lot of stuff there, because this has today in the region I'm in is like a weaving hub, and you still have almost 2,000 weavers actively weaving, and a whole younger generation back into weaving, and almost 60% of these weavers today are on kala weaving, having innovated a range of designers. The fashion industry has taken to it. And it has, of course, meant a lot of challenges reactivating the pre-loom and post-loom processes, innovating with that, bringing higher count. And so today you really have, it poses its own challenges. And the older generation weavers had to be nudged once again to re-educate their youth to weave this kala cotton. And this intergenerational transmission of a lost knowledge system and the emergence of young weavers who are ready to shape and safeguard their heritage has actually activated the fashion industry. And a decade, almost more than a decade after our tryst with kala cotton began, this tenacious fibers today found in a range of products, including fine saris. So this is a coarse cotton, and most of these old world cottons actually are adapted to the weather. So it insulates you against extreme heat and against extreme cold. And therefore they were thick with the short staple. But today there has, of course, you have to reach out to the markets, to the fashion industry, and you have a range of it from the low counts to high counts. And it has been, therefore, this revival has been really accompanied by a range of artists, curators, activists, agriculture scientists. Of course, challenges remain. The challenge is we have been able to localize the local loop and the value chain, but localizing the consumption of this is very important. So it has reached out to the fashion industry in the global world, but our real challenge is to ensure that the ecological handprint and not footprint stays low. We have to ensure that the consumption, the last loop, remains local. I'll stop there and take questions.
That's fascinating, Sushma. I really enjoyed listening to that. And I think I've just been Googling kala as well. I found the images that you mentioned as well, which is fantastic. And I think we have got a link that we just shared in the YouTube channel as well, if people want to have a look and have a look at your website as well to see the cotton that you were talking about and the techniques as well. Really interesting, I think, and lovely link as well to the previous talks around this, and this idea of old world cotton, which I'd never heard of before reading about the initiative that you've been speaking about. And this idea of actually the whole industry having to change around the strain of cotton that you're using, which I never would have even considered. So thank you. It's really, really interesting to hear. I guess I have a first question. Whilst I'd encourage people at home to ask questions if there are things that you'd like to know and to ask Sushma in particular. But you mentioned the premium that was needed to help the group initially to make this production of colour viable. The old world cottons, these indigenous strains, you talked about the advantages they have. Are they cost effective in the current climate, or do they still need support to help make them competitive as a crop?
They need a lot of support, Matthew, to make them competitive, because this is vis-a-vis the genetically modified BT cotton and the New World cottons and American cotton, because as I mentioned, and also what Professor Munjal mentioned, there's such a huge push for the export of cotton. It's a huge industry, and therefore the demand for old world cotton, which your entire the industrial process has not been geared to absorb these short staple cottons. And therefore, they are far more effective still in hand-driven processes, right? Which actually slows down production. And it's the perfect answer for a slow economy and for slow fashions. But with a policy push for a higher export, you have to reconcile with mass production, and that's something we have contended with. So while we have really pushed a whole range of hand spun khadi with kala, which is really very popular, but we have had to ensure that we have tweaked the small scale enterprise and mechanization processes to allow industrial spinning to absorb these kinds of cotton. And so with these difficulties, and the fact that industrial power looms are heavily subsidized. Also, it's a subsidized industry, while the cotton and handloom is not. And therefore, it's really not very competitive. It really needs a big push, and hopefully, with the fact that we are looking for solutions, with the climate risk we are in, both the economic and the ecological vulnerabilities, the seeds, the seed of these kinds of cottons and crops really hold the seed and hold the root for a slow fashion. And I think it's a huge challenge. But if this starts creating a niche, as we have tried to do in India with Kala cotton, it is that niche which will slowly start popularizing. But as I mentioned earlier, the moment it starts actually you start creating localized markets. Today it is still, it's a high value product. Kala textile is still high value because it's entirely hand driven. So the only way really is to ensure that the farmers continue and conserve their farming is if there is a takeoff for their product, for the wool, for the cotton. That would happen only when the weaving and fiber and the textile finds a local market which is accessible, which is cost effective. Right? So yeah.
I think you mentioned 2 to 3% of cotton grown is the old varieties. Is much of that exported, or does it stay local in the way that you were talking about? Have people outside India seen the advantages and the qualities of this type of cotton, or is it locally kept?
So, Matthew, well, I think Kala has actually created a trend, and slowly in other parts of India now, indigenous varieties are being looked at in Telangana, for instance, in Rajasthan. These are early days, but the old world cotton has not even been going into textiles. they go largely as raw cotton into fillings of mattresses, right? So the challenge and the work that happened was to bring it back into the textile industry and into the fashion industry. So it's a long walk yet.
Yes, so interesting though, and I think an idea that we've not come across in our talk so far. So I think it's great to hear actually the role, the variety of cotton plays here, which we haven't touched on. What I'd like to do now is to bring in our other speakers back in for a bit more discussion, and I'd like to pose a question to the group, and you can wave at me who would like to go first in answering this. But I'd like to ask really, well, because cotton is quite a contentious raw material, thinking about sustainability, and there's Sushma, you talked about the high water need for a lot of the current varieties. So I just wonder what you see as a role, or if cotton has a role to play in sustainable fashion in the future. And I think it follows on maybe from, yes, Simon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a question that gets asked a lot, and there's a lot of misconceptions that fly around. So I think other speakers have mentioned the fact that cotton is drought tolerant, can survive in arid areas. It's tough enough that it was used to regenerate soils around Fukushima in Japan after the tsunami. It doesn't, contrary to what we tend to believe, need a lot of water. What it tends to be is over-irrigated to try and get more crop for the drop, and actually that's counterproductive. The thing that has to be evaluated, and this is a hyperlocal issue, you have to look at when you grow cotton, if you grow cotton, is there enough water for it? But farmers in Australia, for example, they now treat cotton as an opportunity crop. They don't grow it on a regular basis. If there's not enough water, they won't grow cotton. So it depends on rainfall, it depends on what's in the water basin. And that's the sensible way to go about it. And if we're moving into a circular economy and into a slow fashion world, and if we go back to some of these varieties that are more adapted to different areas, then we can do that because we're not under pressure to keep growing cotton. We grow what we need when we need it. And everybody in that sense becomes an opportunist cotton grower or fiber grower of any kind. So, it's aspirational, but if we're going to deal with climate, with overconsumption, all of these linked problems, then we have to move to that world.
Thank you, Simon. Sushma.
Yes, Matthew, I think essentially it also means, just following from what Simon said, a huge policy push, because if you were to understand that, given our commitments to lowering carbon emissions, one would start understanding that staying with the ecology of a region and tying the economics and allowing culture to follow nature is the most sensible economics. To allow interdependencies, to allow the artisanal as well as mechanized and industrialized world to absorb and pick up ecologically sustainable kinds of farming and cotton growing. That is what will sustain fashion also.
Thank you so much. Surender, is there anything you would add on this?
Yeah, I think I was alluding to the different policies that government has been proposing in India. There is something called technology upgradation scheme. Again, I think there are different ways in which cotton can be grown, and there are technological inputs that are being needed, including some sort of harvesting, as well as some sort of irrigation facilities. Some of these can be covered within the technological upgradation scheme that has been proposed by the Indian government. So, from the policy perspective, from the economics perspective, I would say that some kind of technological upgradations would be required to keep this sustainable production in place.
Thank you. And just looking at the some of the comments we've had in as we're going along, there's one when we're talking about slow fashion and maybe changes in consumption. The query is really whether the cost of living crisis we're having at the moment is likely to put progress back. And I guess some of the discussion, I think particularly we've had, Simon and Sushma, around potentially these more sustainable farming techniques or cotton being maybe higher price or more labor intensive, and whether that would be an issue as well. Just think about where the cost comes in, if that's going to be a challenge to sustainability. Yep, Simon.
I can, yeah, I'm happy to go. It's always a mistake not to invest in the future during a crisis. You just take the response to energy here in the UK, where you subsidize old fuel and sacrifice new fuel. In the long run is going to cost more. So the program should have been support everybody to get better insulated homes, solar panels if you can afford them, heat pumps, battery storage for everybody, so that when the wind farms are turning, you store all of that future proofs. And it's the same thing with production. The soil is dying. A lot of the soil out there that's growing crops is dead. And we keep it alive by throwing fossil fuel at it every single year. So the only way to continue producing food and fiber in the future is to undo the damage. It takes thousands of years to produce good soil. 40% of the world's soils are degraded. So we can't, business as usual just won't wash it, unless business as usual is only a generation into the future. When people talk about 10 years to stop climate change, well, it's as close to the truth as there is. Every year we keep doing the thing.
Thank you, Simon.
I was just going to add to what you were saying, Simon, as I have been doing this this evening. That one is, of course, the impact on the soils, which is so important. The other important aspect, which we tend to forget, is that these artisanal chains actually ensure huge amounts of employment. In India, after agriculture, the handloom and handicrafts is the second largest employer. And it's often seen as a sunset industry, but therefore, the more we focus on the regenerative farming, on circular economies, on sustainable conservation of seeds and biocultural knowledge systems, we also ensure that more and more people are actually employed through the circular economies. We have found this with what we did with the Kala cotton, that weavers who had actually started getting on to labor sites and into industries as industrial labor actually started coming back. And I think for me the indicator is when a younger generation continues with their traditional occupation. That means it is making economic sense to them, right? Otherwise,
Absolutely.
they would not be doing it.
And Sushma, I think that's a really positive note for us to finish on. Just conscious of time, and I think that's a great note in terms of actually the potential benefit of these more sustainable and ecologically beneficial approaches, in terms of that can have benefits for the economy, for employment, and so on as well. So with that, I'd like to thank each of you for joining and sharing your thoughts tonight. So this brings our event to a close. Thank you very much, Sushma, Simon, and Surender, for joining us and sharing your expertise. Absolutely delighted with the discussion. And thank you to everybody joining us from home for sending in your questions to our speakers. And we hope you enjoyed tonight's event. If you did, why not let us know by tweeting us at Uni Leeds Engage and using the hashtag #BeCuriousLates. We'd also really welcome your feedback on tonight's event. So please do let us know what you thought by filling in the short evaluation form, which should be available on the link, which we'll share in a moment on the chat. And those of you who booked this session in advance will also receive an email with a link to the evaluation form tomorrow. So apologies, you can't escape it, it will follow you, but we really value your feedback and your thoughts. Be sure to keep an eye on the Be Curious website for other upcoming events and announcements. Lots of things going on across the University of Leeds, and we'd love you to join us for other sessions as well on a whole range of topics. But that's it from us now. Have a lovely evening, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. Goodbye.